Center World and Universe. Hello, Abigail, how are you today?
Hello, I'm well. Thank you for having me.
It is a real pleasure to have you, and we're really excited about your participation today in this latest installment of the webinar series that's being promoted by the postgraduate program in Letras, Language and Literature, at the Universidade Federal do Paraná. And Abigail Villagrán, who is very festive today in front of us, is the founding director of the Writing Center at UPAEP in Puebla, Mexico. And she is the founding member of the Mexican Writing Center Network, created to promote and support writing centers all over Mexico. She recently earned her PhD at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, where her research was chosen for the Promising Future Research in Composition Award in 2019. I had the pleasure of fairly recently making Dr. Villagrán's acquaintance through a Facebook group, which is also recently created, which is Writing Centers of Brazil. And a lot of people, I think, in the North American context are pretty much unfamiliar with the writing center reality outside of the United States and Canada, and sometimes are even surprised that there are writing centers in other places. And but moreover, I think that it's important for people like Dr. Villagrán and myself, and recently we had a webinar with writing center directors in Russia to connect with each other, because I think that maybe our realities have a lot to do with each other, and maybe even more so than writing centers in the United States. I don't know, I'll let her address that. So let me turn it over to Dr. Villagrán. I'm really excited again that you came here. I'm really happy that you accepted. I know that you have a very busy schedule. This time of the semester, I know, is not easy. And we welcome you, and I turn the virtual mic over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And hello, everybody. I'm really, really happy to be here. This is an opportunity that has taken me 10 years to witness. I'm so happy to see writing centers coming out, emerging all over the world, and especially in Latin America. I was really happy to hear of the work that Brazil is doing, that Ron is leading, and all the support that he is giving to the Writing Center movement. I think it's going to have a great impact in higher education and beyond. So thank you for having me, and I'll go ahead and share my screen, if that's all right. Let's see if this works. Okay. Is that, can you see it now? Okay. All right, so today I will address a topic that came out of my doctoral research. Today's webinar is titled Fostering a Community of Practice for Writing Tutors. It will address some of the findings from my doctoral research, which is based on the writing tutor community at UPAEP's Writing Center in Puebla, Mexico. And if you haven't heard the concept of communities of practice, I can anticipate that as you get acquainted to it, you might find that it is already happening in your own writing center. So I'm going to take the following minutes to tell you a little bit about that and some of my findings. So first, some context. So this is a 3-minute video. I don't think we'll have time to watch all of it, but it has some of the photographs that I have been gathering throughout the 10 years that our writing center has been functioning. So it was founded in 2010. Its original aim was to support students writing through a peer tutoring program. Tutors were recruited from every college program. So we have tutors that are starting to become engineers, or medicine students, or students who study design, humanities, etc. So that's been a really, really productive combination of people. Most tutors who participate do so as part of the 480 hours of social service that are required for every college student in Mexico. So this is something we all have to do when we're in college in order to graduate. And you can choose from many programs and many projects. For our particular program, students have to be recruited and selected, and then they undergo training, an initial training program. But they can stay for as long as they have to fulfill their social service hours. Most of them will stay a little bit longer as volunteers. Aside from tutoring, they also engage in collaborative projects inside and outside of UPAEP to keep supporting writing culture and helping people who require it. For instance, tutors work with a large diversity of writing and writers, offering a wide array of support activities, also in multiple scenarios. So, I mean, that's basically what we've been doing. There are plenty of more pictures. It's just 10 years of images. It's a lot to watch. So I'm going to go ahead and click. So in this context, we can find some of the characteristics that, even though cannot be generalizable, they can be considered as common to many writing centers in the region we now know as the Global South. So instead of using deprecating terms such as developing countries or third world or things like that, Global South is a term that addresses our commonalities without necessarily having a comparative approach with other regions. Writing centers in the Global South are working towards harnessing situations of constant change, for example, which are especially challenging for emerging writing centers. Also, if not critically addressed, often our peripheral position regarding the West could result in patterns of subordination or tutelage. And finally, writing centers in the Global South not only face a diversity of writers with different writing needs, but also a diversity of writing traditions, expectations, learning environments, and of course, a diversity of writing tools. So this is kind of like the context in which our writing center emerged, and it's possible that other writing centers might feel identified with one or of these characteristics, but I found that in the examples that I've been looking at, most of writing centers in this region, instead of looking at this as limitations, we're beginning to harness them to empower a particular learning culture. So in this context and over the course of 10 years, I was able to observe a resilient community of writing tutors in UPAEP's Writing Center. I noticed that they collaborated continuously, they were solving problems together, and they were making decisions based on consensus. Also, they were engaging in creating projects, in creating solutions and learning opportunities. And I think mostly what I started noticing is that they were really efficient learners. So because of the situations in which many writing centers emerge, sometimes there is not a platform ready-made for the writing center to be supported by. And so in the meantime, while we work to create that platform, tutors have sometimes like to adhere to their own resources and to solve the problems themselves. And so they become good learners because they're also very autonomous, and they face the reality of their common practice together. So this is something that I started noticing, and through conversations that I have been having with some colleagues, I find that this is common to many contexts, especially through the Global South. So this new term that you have been hearing about, communities of practice, comes originally from the work of Lee and Wenger, which was a seminal work in 1991. What they did is they studied learning communities in informal environments, for example, midwives in Mexico. And they were interested in seeing how newcomers became participants. And while participating, they started learning the trade or the practice. Wenger continued in this line of work, and he developed more and more research. And one of the definitions that I like about communities of practice is groups of people who share a concern, a set of problems, or a passion about a topic, and who deepen their knowledge and expertise in this area by interacting on an ongoing basis. So I've highlighted some of the important words because they show us the importance of coming together, of a community that coalesces for a common purpose, and they share knowledge and expertise in a constant interaction. So this looked pretty much the same as what I was witnessing in my own writing center. So some other colleagues in the literature have pointed to the importance of this community approach to writing centers, notably the work in the Everyday Writing Center book by Geller, Iodis, Condon, Carroll, and Bouquet in 2007 was the first to explore the community of practice approach for writing centers. More recently, Mark Hall has also studied it, especially how it applies to understanding tutoring practice. But this approach also adheres to some of the most deeply rooted pedagogical principles in writing centers. For instance, it is empowering, it is agency building, and most of all, it's with an informal learning approach, such as the one proposed by Ivan Illich in Deschooling Society. So a writing center, we know it's often a very institutionalized part of higher education, but it is also an informal environment for learning. It's an environment where you learn from and with your peers, from a collaborative approach, in joint activities. It is also a learning culture. And as Geller et al. point out, it is often a place where you can expect only to be surprised and to face zones of indeterminacy continuously. And so for us in the Global South, this is particularly important because it's part of our everyday reality. So writing centers appear to be especially suited for our everyday practice. So I also asked the question, how is it that writing center pedagogy can be good for the Global South? And I came out with 5 tensions that I think really showcase the importance of writing center pedagogy to our context. The first one is because it's a non-directive approach, which is in contrast with the often prescriptive nature of some of the most traditional education, particularly in Latin America. It is also informal, which is in opposition with more institutionalized versions of education. So informal learning can happen everywhere. You might need to have a very specialized place for the writing center, but honestly, if you don't have an assigned space, you can still have a writing center precisely because of the informal nature of learning that happens within the writing center pedagogy. Another thing that's interesting is the one-on-one approach. Often we tend to focus too much on standards, on what is expected to gain at the end of a learning process. But when you focus on the student one-on-one, then the learning reality is altered to whatever that particular student is in need of, looking for, and in the context of writing centers, whatever he or she is writing. So this takes us to the next one, which is a student-centered approach, which is mainly what writing centers are all about. Instead of focusing on the teacher, who is generally making all the decisions, taking all the control, evaluating, etc., focusing on the student also gives them back the authority, the power, and the control to decide about their own learning. And ultimately, writing centers are collaborative instead of unidirectional. So the learning that happens is not only important for the writer who comes for support to the writing center, it's also important for the tutor who is involved in this learning process, and in doing so becomes a better writer himself or herself, and also becomes more aware of their own learning strategies and their own learning profiles. So for all of these reasons, I think the writing center phenomena is really revolutionary for contexts such like many of us, in which many of us work and basically spend most of our time, that are still very traditional, very centered on the teacher, on standards, instead of looking at what each specific student needs and requires. So all in all, this is a distinction between authority and agency. So I believe firmly that writing center pedagogy can support a learning environment that empowers and creates agency to everyone who's involved. So with my own research, I decided to focus mostly on tutor education. Specifically, I wanted to know, in general terms, how tutors learn from their community of practice, and if there was a potential to construct knowledge out of the community of practice. So in general terms, how is it that they bring about learning and the knowledge from their community of practice? And I apologize because this looks very complicated as a slide. These are my main findings, some of my main findings, but basically what it is three main elements that came out of research. The first one has to do with learning, the second one with knowledge, and there's a transition between the two that we can establish as knowledge ability. And I'm glad that this talk is in English because I haven't found an effective way to translate this to Spanish. So if anybody listening could perhaps propose one, I would be really grateful. So about learning, I focused on three aspects in the theory: mutual engagement, joint enterprise, and shared repertoire, to look at their learning culture. How is it that they were engaging in learning within the community of practice? And what I found most notably is that they were always negotiating. They negotiated everything. And in negotiating, they were working together and learning together. For example, they negotiated different expectations, their own and the writers, but also the expectations within the writing center and those within the institution. The expectations from them as a group in a collaborative project with the expectations that the people who they were working with at that moment had. Also, they talk a lot about different levels of commitment, which is really interesting. Just because they become part of a community of practice, that doesn't mean that everybody is equally engaged and committed. And so they often have to negotiate with people who are not as committed as others. This is also something that happened over and over, changing plans when somebody doesn't arrive, when they went to a place for a collaborative project and there was no one to open up. So little things like that happen very, very often, and they became very used to having to change plans in order to fulfill their goals. So frustration is an important part of their learning, and I found that negotiating kept it in control in terms of taking frustration as a means to learn. And finally, making themselves understood. As an emerging writing center, a lot of people still don't realize exactly what we do, or they come looking for something else. And so they also need to negotiate with people to make sure that they are still providing something that they find practical and needed, whilst not leaving aside what it is that a writing center does. So learning is not necessarily always positive. It's not necessarily in a controlled environment, and it doesn't necessarily involve writing itself. So another thing that I found is their main focus, or the thing that they found that they know the most, that they learned how to do, is their knowledgeability. And it turns out that it has to do with engaging others to collaborate. So this is where their focus is most of the time. And I find that this is obviously involved in tutoring, but it affects environments even beyond the tutoring session. So if they are good, or if they become good, knowledgeable at engaging others to collaborate, then they can succeed with the particular projects that they had to confront in the writing center. So having this knowledgeability meant working together, learning together, and solving problems together, but also facing others. So they found themselves to be more a community, to coalesce even more once they were facing other people, like outsiders. So with this in mind, I also looked at the knowledge that came out of this particular formula, specifically what knowledge was created, shared, and preserved. So what I found is that there was like a cycle going on between creating and sharing among the tutoring session and their collaborative projects. So they learned about tutoring and they shared their learning for collaborative projects. And then what they found there in terms of engaging others came back to the tutoring session. And so they were able to engage people in their tutoring and became mentors. So apparently, those who learned about collaboration in the collaborative projects were more likely to become mentors for newcomers and show them how collaboration work and how to engage others. Another surprising thing is I found that they were taking this knowledge and using them in their current professional activities. Because my population was mostly ex-tutors, so tutors that were no longer working in the writing center, a lot of them were already having professional activities. And so their experience also showed how this same knowledgeability became useful in their current work. So they talk a lot about people skills, for example, about adapting a process and making it their own, about being open and receptive to difference. So things like this became very, very important and came out of their community of practice. So in general terms, this is kind of like the approach to learning and knowledge construction that I found in the community of practice, in particular at UPAEP. So there are some important implications for tutor education, and although I have to say it's not generalizable, but there are some takeaways that I think are interesting and could nurture the approach for other writing centers. Essentially, collaborating and engaging others to negotiate accountability and ambiguity. So if tutors found themselves able to work together in order to engage others, they also use that collaborative ethos to negotiate the ever-changing environment, even to negotiate accountability and the ambiguity that they were facing in an everyday basis. So in terms of agency, particular things like making decisions about their learning, creating projects, building identity, constructing their practice, and owning the tutoring process were mentioned by various tutors. Also, in terms of collaboration, I saw that they made decisions collaboratively, they engaged in mentoring. They also used collaboration to deal with frustration, to develop what they called people skills, and mostly they talk a lot about adapting processes and ultimately owning them. So one interesting thing is in the training, initial training they get obviously introduced to the tutoring process, which they all find useful, but they all said that they had to adapt it, like obviously. So that became part of an ongoing process until they found that processes always need to be adapted. In terms of learning and knowledge building, they found that learning had to be engaging, collaborative, flexible. It's an ongoing process, so it doesn't stop with the training that we give them at the very first month. It has to continue. For instance, we do a weekly meeting, and we do other activities in which tutors keep working on their own writing and on their own tutoring skills. It's also very important, as they mentioned, to relinquish control. So if they want things to be in a particular way, they will often get frustrated. So if they lose that sense of having control, it is perceived as better. And also, learning and knowledge building is contextualized, so it depends on where it happens and the people who are involved. And it's also used throughout the whole landscape of practice, which basically means this not only happens in the tutoring session, it also happens in the collaborative projects, and ultimately it can happen in their own professional activities, in their future professional activities. So this becomes kind of their own learning culture, and they can use it whenever they think it's necessary, even outside of the writing center. And so obviously for us writing center directors, this also has some implications and some reflections to consider. For instance, the fact that a community of practice needs an ongoing effort. So it's not something that you do at the beginning and then forget about it. It needs cultivating. Another thing that I think is challenging is to really create informal and collaborative learning. Sometimes because we are called directors, we really want to direct in all the broad sense of the word. And we don't appreciate the value of informality and collaborative learning as much as we should. So it is challenging also because you're bringing about an informal environment to a very institutionalized setting, which is higher education. So you're going to have to find ways in which those two can work together. Another interesting thing is I find relinquishing control can be hard for some of us because everything in our discipline and in our profession tells us to have control on things. And when we do that to learning, I think we just turn it off inadvertently. So we really need to be reflective about our use of authority and control. And empowering tutors actually helps a lot. I remember a conversation with Dr. Carol Severino, and she said once, if you don't trust your tutors, you don't have a writing center. And I think that has become my principle. I trust my tutors to the point where I can just believe that they will be able to confront any given situation. So you need to do something. I mean, it's not just something that happens magically. There's a continuous effort to empower tutors. And first, they have to believe in themselves, of course, because not everybody in Latin America is used to having power as a student. So I think that's another reason why writing centers can start changing the landscapes in higher education. Also, because of this, one needs to create a support system. So not just leave them alone, but there is a way in which they can come back and ask for help or plan things together, etc. I also found our main limitation was preserving knowledge, because they were reacting to everyday circumstances. What we didn't do as much was preserving all the knowledge that was coming out in an everyday basis. So we were solving problems, and that was okay, but all of that was like produced in during that time got lost in the way. And so you need to be I think deliberate in your ways to preserve the knowledge that is coming out of the community of practice. Also, it's very important for a writing center director to make decisions with the community. So make them together, not only consider them, but create consensus, like real consensus, not just the majority. And that, of course, is really hard. It's not always possible, but there has to be like this, at least this effort to bring about the discussion together. And the last thing is very important, respecting and valuing different forms of participation. As I mentioned earlier, not everybody is equally committed to the Writing Center, but it's okay. Not everybody has to. There are many ways in which one can participate to a Writing Center. If we're truly flexible and open, we should really value people who are just there for one activity, for 1 month, or for a very particular and pragmatic objective. So that is also a way of learning from the community of practice. So basically, that's the gist of it. And what I like to think when I reflect about how communities of practice can really be important for writing centers in the Global South. I remember this particular quote by Wenger. It says, the combination of perturbability and resilience is a characteristic of adaptability. Learning involves a close interaction of order and chaos. The continuity of an emergent structure derives not from stability, but from adaptability. And so that last sentence really makes me think about we can do it, regardless of how much our environment changes and how unstable it is. It is because of that unstableness. Sorry, I forgot how to make it a word. But the important thing is to adapt. And if we can adapt, then we become resilient. And that, I think, are the building blocks for the Writing Center phenomenon in places like the Global South. And I think that's all. So thank you. I'm also providing my email in case you want to talk more about this. And I give back the microphone to Ron.
Let's see. Let me just stop the sharing here. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Muchas gracias. As you put on your last slide. So much food for thought, and I invite everybody who's participating right now to put in any questions that you might have or any comments. I have a few myself. First of all, my general impression that comes out of everything you presented is that there is so much more than, as you put it, just writing that is being developed within the Writing Center context for our Writing Center tutors. They are adapting on so many levels, and they're developing attributes that will serve them, as you pointed out, beyond the Writing Center experience. And I'm wondering, since there's so much value that you're pointing out there in your research that goes beyond what we writing tutoring per se, I'm wondering, are you able to communicate that, or do you even try to do that, to the university powers that be? Because we're constantly, as I heard a Writing Center director put it recently, we're constantly evangelizing to our higher ups about the value of our work, and pointing out to them, hey, look what we do here, look what we do there. And here you have some empirical data that show, hey, look what we're doing here. What do you think about that?
Well, it's been a journey, and I agree. We often spend a lot of time preaching the gospel. But I think it also comes back to this idea of relinquishing control. You cannot decide what others are going to think about your Writing Center, and ultimately you cannot force a learning culture upon anyone. So this is a culture, and it's very different from what you would ordinarily see in higher education, in traditional higher education environments. So I think what has been working over the course of this 10 years are concrete actions. So the university has had to witness our tutors doing stuff all the time. So they're out there, they're giving tutorings, they're doing projects, we are having workshops. And so I think this becomes more persuasive than anything I can communicate myself. But having said that, it's still a struggle, because the change that we are looking forward for happening is really, really a big one. And it is a change that's coming out from the students themselves. So it will take some time for people to decide that they have enough power, that they can be trusted, that they should be listened to. But once that happens, I can anticipate a lot that the changes will be coming on quite quicker.
Yeah, you mentioned there's a couple of questions I'll get to in a second. You mentioned that in the context of the global South, the practices that you mentioned about being non-directive and informal and one-on-one and student-centered might be especially interesting. Do you feel that this is something that is more global South, or do you see this because you're also familiar with the North American context? I mean, to what extent is this especially relevant to the global South?
Well, that's the context that this particular writing center emerged in. But yeah, speaking to colleagues, I think that this has implications for everybody, particularly for writing center directors all over the world. And now we are witnessing a perfect example of how much adaptation still needs to be done and how much we shouldn't be taking for granted. We all were suddenly online and writing centers were all up for the challenge. That doesn't surprise me because of this collaborative ethos and the resilience that is ingrained deeply into their history. So if you look at the origin of writing centers in the 60s, there's a lot of this same type of discourse in those very early works, saying how they were marginalized and how nobody was looking at them. Right now, that's not the reality. Right now, it is a very established phenomena in most universities, right? But because they came out from this struggle, I think we still have the potential to adapt to any given circumstance. So it also reminds me of the essence of universities, right? It's just one student learning from another student, and that's just the basic environment that we should provide for learning, I think.
Yeah, and hence the therein lies that conflict that you mentioned, the chaos and control, and it really kind of cuts against so much of the way the archetypical educational models are built on that. Okay, you have a syllabus and you develop it, and you have outcomes that you are supposed to meet, and so on, and assess those, and so on, and suddenly you're talking about, well, actually, you should think about how can you relinquish a bit of that control, empower your students to do a bit more on their own, and as you yourself mentioned, it kind of there's a conflict even with the role of the writing center director her himself, which is, okay, wait a minute, I'm a director. That's that root word there, directives. I'm a director. And so how do you reconcile that, you, Abigail? I mean, how has your concept of your own role evolved, and how do you do that in practice?
It's a really good question because that's kind of like the questions I ask myself every day. I am actually also involved in assessing learning outcomes in my university. Um, so yeah, people often don't realize how is it that you're in this informal environment and then you are like all about standards and learning outcomes. I don't think that they are set against each other. It's just that we need to acknowledge all the actors that are involved in learning. And it's not just you, even if you have that director name, that only means that maybe you are able to see things from a bigger perspective, and then you can help better. You can organize things better, and you can provide resources more effectively. But if we engage students in this formula of attaining learning outcomes ultimately, you're going to have to relinquish control. And that will create like their own group of empowered individuals who decide on their own what is it that they want to learn and how, and they're going to come to you whenever they need it, and you're just going to be a guide. And you know what, if we don't address the exact learning outcome that we wanted, then that's for us to think about. Like, that's a good thing, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We
Yeah.
really need to think about how we're listening to the reality and we're responding to it effectively.
I agree. I mean, that gels with my own experience that I find that just being a sincere listener can get you really far. And by that, I mean, not just sort of, you know, listening with your ears and then nodding your head, but actually saying, okay, I like what you're saying there. Like, for example, during a team meeting, let's put that
Yeah.
into action. I love that idea and let's do something about it. So they really felt heard and empowered. And, and also the trust that's involved there. I think that students, as you say, they're not, at least I can say that it's the same thing in here in Brazil, that they're not necessarily used to being entrusted with such power and to
That's true.
decide things. And I want to get to a couple of really good questions that have come up here. And the first one here that I've identified is from Thais Deschamps, who is actually a writing center tutor here at the university, and she asks, "Have you found ways of preserving that knowledge? Can you talk about knowledge preservation, of going beyond personal contributions that happen in a particular time and making them part of the institutional accumulated knowledge?"
Yikes. Yeah, that's the question. That's the challenge. So thank you for that. We're actually on it right now, because that's one of the limitations that we found in the research. It's not an easy thing to do, as you mentioned. I mean, you can ask individually, and then you can make your own assumptions. But I guess the challenge is making sure that the community as a whole is using and using the knowledge in the same way. So I think it's something that happens with time. And I think it's something that has to be done systematically.
Mm.
So the answer would be research, definitely. For example, right now we're engaging in an assessment process for our writing center, and that I'm going to try to make it 360 degrees and to have many people participate. And I'm not going to be the only one looking at the data. I think that can be one way, but again, it is limited. Another thing, for example, that's suggested by Mark Hall is inquiry. So having this continuous dialogue with your tutors, asking them questions, making them write, blog posting, things like that. So that dialogue is a continuous methodology of building knowledge. And then you can have that data and look at it and find what comes out of it. But in my experience, because this is a constructivist approach, you would have to involve the whole community, even in the process of analyzing it. And
Yeah,
that's the challenging part, I think. But yes.
yeah, that's a. You mentioned blog posting. Do your tutors keep a blog?
No, we don't. We tried, but they didn't find it natural.
Uh, uh,
That's kind of like not the way they communicate. They have a WhatsApp and we have a Facebook group.
yeah.
And they, for them, writing is kind of like the writing thing is still individual. So they, for example, they write book reviews or essays and then they have them published, but they share them in with the group, so they read them out loud and they get feedback sometimes.
Oh,
And
that's
so
nice.
that's the collaborative part. But the writing the collaboratively hasn't really been successful.
Mm.
But I don't know, maybe in the future, because I have found that different generations of tutors bring like different characteristics. So I cannot even generalize with my own tutors. They've been changing so much. Right now, they're working on a podcast, for example, and they're doing that together. um, so it's just the collaborative writing that hasn't really been successful.
Oh yeah, I mean that's understandable. The podcast sounds really cool. As I understand it, I think your tutors and my tutors might be communicating at some point, and who knows, maybe we can collaborate that way somehow, read each other's stuff.
Yeah, yeah, they're already talking to each other to set up a date.
Yeah. I want to also acknowledge Dwayne Theobald's comment here from Georgia, and saying that the visibility of what the Writing Center does is key. This is important, not just for the administrators at our institutions, but it is also valuable to drawing in more students and extending your reach. And that goes back to that question I asked about, the visibility of what we do. Jano Palvin in Berlin asks, do you think that the community of practice approach is suitable or is useful for a writing center startup situation where lecturers are tutoring, at least initially? What aspects of your approach at UPAEP would be most relevant?
So the difference would be that this is with lecturers, right?
Yeah.
I would say it's even more important because one needs to change our role as lecturers, right? We're not doing the exact same thing. We're not teachers in the writing center. And so I think a community of practice approach can really accelerate that process in that it creates a different learning culture among the members. And so they can like change their hats and become writing tutors. I don't know what will happen later if you decide to include peer tutors. That might be a different learning community, but I think community of practice it's just for any group of people who share a purpose and who are engaged in learning and knowledge building. So it also has the added value of creating a very particular learning culture that then you can build upon for your future efforts.
I would, I mean, our writing center also doesn't have lecturers or tutors, but I think that would make sense. You mentioned, speaking of tutoring, that when you do the initial tutor training at your writing center, that they almost always say that the practices had to be adapted.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, what did you mean by they had to be adapted?
Yeah, well, we don't have the experience of tutoring ourselves as writing center directors, most of us here in Latin America, right? So we read and we look at tutorials and we go to conferences, but we are still making up stuff, right? Saying, this is, I think, how it should happen. And I think you need that. You need a basis. You need an idea of a process to begin with. But once you're facing your the writer, the real person with the real needs and the real goals, you find that well, you need to adapt everything because sometimes, I mean, something that started happening is people came with poetry.
Oh yeah.
And we were not prepared for poetry, right? We were prepared for building a thesis statement and arguments, right? So they started adapting themselves, which is also changing their own ethos as tutors and becoming more listeners, responding as a reader, etc. So all of this is part of the things that we're finding in the knowledge preservation that is important, how they adapt processes and what specific aspects comes out of that adaptation. For example, we have recently received the CRLA certification, which is very focused on very particular outcomes. And we've also had to adapt our own training course to fit those outcomes. But I have to say, there was nothing lost, honestly. So we managed to really adapt it and doing it organically so that it works for us. And tutors know that that's just a starting point and that they should also be prepared to face the unknown. Because writing in Latin America is not as, I don't even know the word I'm looking for. You cannot have concrete expectations of what people are going to be writing. There's still a lot of work to be done on genres, for example. Because people believe that every academic writing is the same, and so you can get all sorts of things and even poetry. So yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think that it would be nice, at least I don't know about the context of Mexico, but I feel like here in Brazil, there's not a whole lot of critical awareness of Brazilian writing genres, or what was writing in their own language. And then often, at least in the course that I teach on at the undergraduate level, the first time they ever have any kind of genre awareness focus is writing in English. And then it's sort of, you know, the effects of that are, you know, another subject for another talk, I think.
Right.
But I really like, you know, it seems to me that what you're talking about in terms of the adaptability and how that adaptation arises sort of organically, you know, based on what's happening on the ground with your tutors and their experience. I think there's a kind of symbiosis in that dynamic with what you're talking about with empowering your tutors, because if you didn't listen to your tutors, if you didn't entrust them with the power and say, you know, what you do and your practices that you can run with, and then you're reporting on those practices can be integrated into our systems. If you didn't do that, then there wouldn't be this, maybe there wouldn't be this adaptation so much. It's this prescription of, okay, I'm the director, this is what you do, follow this formula, and that's it.
That's true, but also it's not for everybody. It's been hard. Of course, because I'm the director, tutors look at me as the director. And even though I strive to have this non-directive approach, I cannot control like what they want out of the leadership. And so sometimes that has bring about frustration, definitely, you know. So it's also a negotiation of leadership, what I call an ecology of leadership. And sometimes it's really uncomfortable, particularly for students who just want to like follow an instruction. They just don't want to think so much sometimes about everything.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on that because you talk about how there are different forms of participation.
Yep.
And there are those who are maybe gung-ho and excited about being in the writing center and want to, whatever, improve as tutors or whatever. And then there are those who maybe, you know, are different. How do you in your writing center and you as director, how do you deal with that? I mean, do you follow sort of a positive reinforcement of those who, what do you do?
Well, yeah, that's hard. Because if I did something, I would be directing, like basically saying, you are going in a different path. What I do is I listen. No, I try to listen. And often what happens is the community itself negotiates it. And sometimes it works. I mean, sometimes enough participation is like a little participation is enough participation. One thing I found in my research is that tutors decided at one point not to include one person at all in like the following project. And I didn't hear about that at all. So that was their decision. And they only told me about it like 5 years later. But of course, they are out there dealing with problems and they have to make these decisions. And if somebody's participation is not efficient, then yes, they have all the right not to include that person in the following projects. So that's one way they deal with it. But often they just come and talk to me about things and we just talk about it together. And some people just stay for a semester if that's not a good fit for them. But some people stay for 4 years. So yeah,
wow,
it's up to them.
Actually, that leads me to another question I had. This what you mentioned about 4 years, which is that part of the original Lev and Wenger work around participation in community of practice involved apprenticeship. And so I imagine that in your writing center, you have people who are more senior, who've been there for 4 years, and those who come in. How do you integrate that? How do you try to systematize a kind of apprenticeship there? What do you do?
Yeah, well, it's not systematized, but they are integrated in many aspects of the learning that goes on. One of which is they are often part of the initial training. So I'm not the only one talking to the tutors about what tutoring is. Because I mean, honestly, that's not a practice that I created. So I feel like foreign to the practice. So what I like to do is invite people who have been doing that for years, and they are very glad to come and talk to the newcomers. They're also involved in recruitment. So we ask, for example, for particular things like an exam or an essay, and they help me read, they help me evaluate, they give me their opinion. Sometimes they decide to include someone that I wouldn't have included, or the other way around. And I think they ultimately know what the community needs even more than I do sometimes. So I really respect their opinion in that regard. They're also included in projects, in particular projects that they want to participate with, even though they're not responsible for them anymore. Um, Even tutors who have graduated have come back and help out. And now that we have the certification, some senior tutors that are already graduating are coming back to get the certificate with the newcomers. So that's going to be interesting, having those two very different groups of tutors together.
Well, you mentioned that, speaking of recruitment, that one of the reasons that tutors come to your writing center and want to get involved in the first place is because of these, what was it that you called, the hours that they have to have?
The social service.
Social service hours. Okay, so they come for the social service hours, but do you feel that that's why they stay there, or do you feel that there's something else going on that keeps them there for 4 years?
Right. Yeah, that's why they come. But maybe that's not why they stay, especially when they stay just to volunteer, like without any need for them to do it. Like this semester, we involved students with a scholarship, and the university decided to do the scholarship in another way. And so they weren't forced to do the scholarship with us, but they stayed, most of them. And so they're doing kind of like two scholarship programs at the same time. I think it's not the writing center itself, is the people that they collaborate with, that they meet with every day, like-minded individuals. They all are looking for a similar approach to learning, and they have like similar principles to things, and so they find kindred spirits, I think.
Yeah, that's consistent with my experience too. Heidi DeMello, who's in Ubatuba, I think, which sounds like a beautiful beach area to be in today, was wondering about your recruitment as far as writing and language proficiency and such. And I actually had a similar question, which was, do your tutors, do most of them come from the what we call the Letras course here, so language course or Spanish or English course?
Right. So we don't, at this point, we don't have a writing program at the university. So the writing center is the writing program in many
Yeah.
ways. I recently read this from an article in Praxis about writing centers in Germany, and they also believe that the writing center is the program. So what we do is we ask for a teacher's recommendation letter, and then there's an exam they have to take about reading proficiency and reading also, reading comprehension of academic texts and scientific writing. And there is a written exam also. So they have to submit an essay that we grade with a rubric. And they have to be above average to be able to become a tutor.
And do you have a lot of people knocking on your door for those?
Actually, I do, which is surprising. I didn't know that we were going to be so popular. I think the reason why we're popular is because most social service projects happen like far away. So they have to travel. And ours, a lot of it happens within the within campus. So it's comfortable in that sense.
Well, I have a feeling that it's more than just the location. I know that students they talk to each other, and probably they're saying, you should really do Dr. Villagrán's
I hope
course.
so. Yeah,
Because
that's
believe me, they talk to each other. If they didn't like it, you wouldn't have so many people signing up.
Yeah, well, I have enough. I mean, we end up rejecting more than we would like, actually. But yeah, one of my worries was not having enough people interested because we don't have a writing program, right? So I was wondering, where are they going to come from? Like, who am I going to ask? which teachers are going to be interested in recommending their students. But it's actually the student who gets interested and then asks for the recommendation letter.
Yeah, and I would say that our experience here is similar, where there's never been a shortage of people who want to get involved on some level, and it comes from many different places, that motivation, but it's inspiring to see that. It's heartwarming to see how much they care about wanting to help other people with their writing. So
and how much they adhere to this type of learning culture. And I think that's the most surprising thing that that I wasn't expecting. Like they're like ready to engage in a different type of strategies, and they're ready to be given more control and more empowerment.
yeah, actually, when you were speaking, I made a comment here that a lot of what you were talking about was reminiscent of sort of Paulo Freire's writings, you know, and one thing that characterizes many of the tutors that we have here at CAPA, our writing center, is that many of them are required to read Freirean literature before they finish their course. And so because of that, I wonder if there's a sort of ethos that they bring into the writing center that maybe is a little bit different from the typical writing center tutor you might get in a North American university context, for example, because they bring this knowledge, or at least some reading on this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, actually, I'm a big fan of Freire, as everybody should be. And I do notice a lot of similarities in his perspective with the community of practice approach. I think the reason why the community of practice worked best for my approach here is that it is more systematized, and it allowed me to look at very specific things and study them. But ultimately, the principles that we are looking for are there in Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, most of all. And I think most tutors recognize, because they are good writers, they have the experience of writing being a powerful tool in their lives, almost making them unstoppable. And not many citizens in Latin America have that same power. And it is so important for democratic societies. And so that also, in and on itself, is engaging enough for tutors to become interested in coming to in being part of the writing center. No, like making a change in their own community in this sense.
Well, I'm aware of the time here, and I have to say that I have found your talk to be really inspiring, and I hope it has inspired a lot of thought among the people who have participated. This will stay online, so that if you want to direct anybody to this later, they can watch it. In the meantime, I know that you and I will be in touch, and our tutors will be in touch with each other, and I feel like that there's so much that we can learn from each other, and our tutors will learn from each other. And so thank you for bringing this very interesting subject to our attention today. And thank you very much for your wonderful thoughts and insights.
No, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to see the rest of your invitation and the rest of the webinars that you're hosting. This is so important for the community of writing centers, the emerging community of writing centers. And to those who are thinking about maybe creating a writing center, just don't think twice, do it. It's really good. You won't regret it. Thank you.
I agree. I second that. And you mentioned Dr. Carol Severino. She's going to be one of the speakers here in our series. She'll be speaking in March about not tutor writing center community of practice, but writing center community practice in general. So I hope that you'll be part of that too, Abigail. And we'll be in touch. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you around. Hopefully we'll see you in the community there, the Writing Centers of Brazil. If not, we'll see you next webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Stay safe. Have happy holidays, everybody. Bye-bye.